Hi there everyone, my name is Waffles the Asian Yen Bear and I have spent far too long over the past few months looking at spreadsheets and I need to justify it by making this video. So let's talk about the 07 meta, shall we? This video is based on data that I gathered from the Eastern meta, as the Western one should be starting right around the time that I drop this video. However, I have collected data from over 3,000 tournament wins, so I think that it's going to be fairly representative of the meta, at least for a good chunk of it. I'm also releasing my spreadsheet publicly, as I do whenever I make these videos, so you can check that down in the description and in the pinned comment. So for today, we're going over the top 10 decks in the meta, how they work, if there are any changes to older deck lists going into 07, and what you need to be preparing for when you start building your decks. But the first thing you need to know is that 07 is a very diverse meta, and every deck has a bad matchup somewhere. That means that there is no perfect leader or deck that you can run that will win every game. And that's part of what makes this meta as fun as it is, at least for me. Yep, I'm looking at you, 08 Law, and your fucking goddamn Black Moria. Number 10, Perona. Perona is the breakout star of this meta. About halfway through the meta, a brand new build emerged, what came to be known as Eco Perona. She used to run a Navy engine, but with the release of the Searcher Otama in OP-07, the Wano engine became the better option. While the first versions of this build were very aggressive, many of the final builds settled back into what Perona does best: cost reduction, resting, and removal, but with the Wano engine to give the deck a lot of draw power. Strength. This deck is very consistent. It's great at getting to the pieces you need. Weakness. Like with other Perona decks, it's a bit slow as many of the playmakers are high cost cards. You can offset this by going for more of an aggressive build, but at that point you may as well be playing Yamato. This means that if you're facing a deck with a lot of character spam, especially if the characters are about 5 cost and above, you can be overwhelmed. Strengths. You've got a lot of blockers, especially ones that can't be KO'd by effects. Weakness. They can be bottom decked by Red Purple Law though with only one Gordon, or they get rested by Bonney. Ultimately, the average Eco Perona deck would look something like this. Number 9, Nami. I'll save the in-depth explanation for the 07 Nami guide, which I've already recorded and gotten ready to upload, so hopefully that's going to be out really soon. You can check the channel for that, but Nami got some nice buffs in this set. Now that she has access to Grandma Nyan and Sengoku for Kuja Pirates and Warlord Search, it allows her to run different variants. Nami was never the top performing deck during this meta, but she would always get 1 or 2 flagship wins every weekend. In fact, a huge portion of her wins come from flagships. She has some really extreme matchups, having a huge advantage versus Enel, but a big disadvantage versus Red Purple Law. So playing Nami this set is a little bit like rolling the dice and hoping that you get good opponents. Kuja Pirate Nami looks a little bit like this and works well against decks that go tall with big boss drops that Margaret can block. Impel Down Nami is mostly the same as before. Warlord's Nami gets to make the most of 7 cost Crocodile, so she works very well against decks that don't run removal. Number 8, Yamato. Even though Perona became the face of Wano as that build fascinated the player base, Yamato was able to take a more aggressive approach to that engine. Fortress Yamato crumbled as too many players were already prepared for 8C Kid in Bonney's deck, but the Sky Island and Wano build stood strong. Strengths. Because of the pressure from his double attack, Yamato was able to handle Black-Yellow Luffy pretty well. Luffy starts off on the back foot as they don't want to take too much damage before they have enough Dawn to start popping off. Weakness. Ultimately, Yamato doesn't really get above this spot as the removal from common black decks and Enel's leader ability make it really difficult for Yamato to have a secure spot in this meta. And the typical Yamato deck looks like this. Number 7, Katakuri. Katakuri fell off hard in this meta as his natural counter Black-Yellow Luffy was very popular. In addition, he didn't get too many upgrades from this set, but another mono-yellow leader, Enel, did. This led to a lot of the player base dropping Katakuri, but he still did have consistent wins each week, just much less than he did before. The only real change we see in the deck list is that now Katakuri runs Blaze Slice, as it lets him have a slightly more favorable matchup into Red Purple Law. Strengths. Life Control and Information. Katakuri's leader ability allows players to make sure they know what's coming up in theirs or their opponent's life so they can play with an information advantage. Weakness. This deck relies too much on big boss drops that take time to get on the field. This allows him to be easily overwhelmed by Red Purple Law in the early game, and it also means that Bonney can force Katakuri to keep one of his bosses rested. Lucci and Moria run consistent ways to remove the bosses, and all of this leads to an environment that makes Katakuri a little bit of a difficult sell. Number 6. Bonney. Bonney is the best screen leader we've seen in a while, making good on green's characteristic gameplay of resting your opponent's characters. She has a simple leader ability that works exceptionally well. For 1 Dawn, when your opponent attacks, you can rest one of their characters or their leader once per turn. That, along with her being part of the worst generation, allows her to take advantage of supernova support, and that led her to being a pretty strong force in the meta. She runs 2 main variants, the pure supernova one and the Don Quixote family hybrid one, and they look like this. Strength. Because she can essentially rest one of your opponent's cards every turn, decks that rely on a small amount of big cards like Enel and Black Yellow Luffy are stopped in their tracks. Regarding the latter, she's actually one of the best counters to Luffy. Weakness. Unfortunately, because she can only rest 1 card per turn, decks that go wide with a lot of small hits can overwhelm her, namely Red Purple Law. Strength. She benefits from a ton of supernova support along with cards that synchronize really well with her leader ability like Uroge and Basil Hawkins. Weakness. She also doesn't have a lot of removal, so opponents that can survive long enough to get several big dudes on the board can take her down as well. Before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor for today. No one, because of course I'm kidding, who would pay for this? But if you've made it this far into the video, you might want to know that I set up a website for people to see the data for the ongoing Eastern metas. It's not anything too crazy, I don't really have a lot of website experience, but I had a decent amount of people requesting a way to get access to the info without having to wait for the meta to finish. And this is kind of my compromise because the spreadsheets are usually super messy until I release them, and that's kind of embarrassing. So here's the URL, use it if you want, otherwise it's all good. Anyway, back to the video. Number 5. New Rob Lucci. Rob Lucci and Moria kind of go hand in hand. They both fit the role of mono black removal, but they do have some minor differences. Lucci tends to utilize the Cypher Pool engine with Spandem and Spandine, and this allows him access to some interesting Moria combos, but he gets held back from doing better by a few factors, including the player's luck. Weakness. Eni's lobby is an extremely important part of this matchup, and there's no way to search it out. This means that players who don't draw into it early enough aren't able to make the most of this deck. Strength. Lucci has access to many different tech options such as Isho, Nightmare Luffy, Stussy, and 8-cost Sabo, so it can be difficult for opponents to predict exactly what's going to come out. The typical deck looks something like this, with the tech spots being able to be switched between those options. Weakness. While the deck has many ways to mill, it struggles to recycle cards easily. Many of Lucci's cards will send cards back to the deck from the trash, but that's going to the bottom, which doesn't make for easy access. Number 4. Black Yellow Luffy. Black Yellow Luffy doesn't really change much, but the addition of Egghead Luffy allows the deck to become more consistent. This generally replaces starter deck Sabo as a removal option. Thankfully, Luffy didn't really need to change much as it's a pretty darn good deck in most matchups. By the end of the meta, it was clear that the deck recipe was figured out. Trust me, I had to enter them all in and pretty much all of them are identical. All that really changes is whether you want to include blocker Evenkoff or not. If you do, you include up to 2 maximum and you reduce the same amount of Makinos from the deck. Strength. This deck is great at dealing with other black decks as it can continually recycle Sabo's KO protection. Weakness. As the deck is pretty straightforward, the plays and deck lists are predictable. This means that experienced opponents will often be able to play around it. Strength. Because of the way Luffy works, the deck can cheat out an absurd amount of Dawn value. For 10 Dawn, you can use the leader effect and play a Moria, which can bring out the 2 kid versions. Then they transform into the adult versions, which are each 5-cost characters. Not to mention the power boost to the leader, so overall, it's great. Weakness. Bottom decking. Because this deck has to have cards on the field or in the trash, if opponents send the right cards to the bottom of the deck, it shuts down the engine. Strength. Black Yellow Luffy's unique color combination allows it to be a staple in any kind of team battle situation like 3v3s and 5v5s. Number 3. Moria. Moria makes the number 3 spot. Moria's ability to discard cards from the opponent's hand with Perona and to KO cards once they hit 2 costs with Absalom make his matchup versus Red Purple Law better than Lucci. This and the familiarity of the leader made him a more popular choice in this meta. Generally, the deck runs the same core cards and Isho as the tech of choice, and you can see that list right here. Strengths. He's able to recycle Moria's very effectively with Dr. Hogback. That means for long games, Moria will be able to outlast other opponents because they can keep playing 8-cost Moria and recycling their other cards from the trash. Weakness. Hand resources are more important in this deck than in Lucci, as you need to discard cards to use Moria's ability. Number 2. Enel. Enel earned himself the name Beginner Hunter. While his matchups were less favorable than other leaders on this list, the pure power this deck includes allows him to take advantage of less experienced players. By the end of the meta, he was one of the most played leaders, so although he had a lower win rate overall than other leaders, the overwhelming number of Enel players shot this guy up to number 2. Enel's build drastically changed from EB-01 to OP-07. While in EB-01 he ran an aggro deck around cheating out Enel with I Am God, but with the addition of 10-cost Ace, he goes back to his roots, and it looks something like this. Weakness. This deck includes several expensive cards. 4 8-cost Katakuri, 4 10-cost Ace, and 4 9-cost Yamato are essential. Out of the 93 decks we registered, 93 of them ran Ace, and 92 of them ran Katakuri and Yamato as well. These cards are the key to staying alive with Enel, and the deck is drastically weaker if you don't include them. Strengths. With those cards included, this deck can survive for quite a long time. That allows players to focus on dealing with the opponent's board, slowly building up their own board, and waiting until the opponent runs out of options. Weakness. Enel needs a bit of time before he can really get online. This means that aggressive red-purple law players can swarm and overwhelm the Enel player before they can really get going. Weakness. This deck doesn't have ways of searching out their boss cards, so it comes down to drawing them. If the Enel player faces a deck with a lot of removal, it's very possible that they run out of boss cards before the other player runs out of removal. Number 1. Red Purple Law. The undisputed number 1 spot was of course going to go to Red Purple Law. He saw consistent results in all sorts of tournaments. There are a couple different variants based on what tech cards the player wants to prioritize. You've got some versions that include Blocker Chopper as a way to continually lower opponent's attack for the leader ability. Others bring Queen or Miss All Sunday for more draw power. Even others use Zorojiro to have an additional way to get Dawn, or a 7-cost Ace for a boss drop. Really, this deck has a lot of different options and can be built in many different ways. Strengths. This deck is excellent at making sure the opponent is not allowed to play the game, as it can remove most characters with ease. Weakness. This deck can brick easily. That's it. There's not really any other weaknesses. Strengths. With Reiju, this deck can make sure they always have resources in hand. And on that note, that's going to be it for me today. Hopefully this has been an informative look at what to expect in the Western version of the meta. Now, which of these decks are you going to be playing? Or are you going to be playing something else that I didn't include? Let me know in the comments down below. My name is Waffles the Asian Yenbear, and I'm gonna take a nap. Wake me up when Law is banned, because OP-08 is so much worse. Bye!